Bristol Borough, Pennsylvania, October 1962. A quiet river town where church bells marked the rhythm of life, and children still rode bicycles along cobblestone streets. But one autumn afternoon, innocence would be shattered inside the most sacred place in town. For decades, locals would whisper about the church on Radcliffe Street, the one where candles flickered but never felt warm again. It was here, inside St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church, that 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty was last seen alive. Carol was known throughout Bristol for her bright smile and unwavering faith. Her neighbors called her the little angel of Radcliffe Street. She sang in the church choir, devoured books from the town library, and never missed Sunday Mass. On October 22nd, 1962, Bristol was wrapped in its usual calm. The air smelled with smoke and river mist. School had just let out. Carol, in her plaid skirt and cardigan, climbed onto her bicycle, carrying a small stack of library books pressed against her chest. She had one simple plan: return the books, stop by St. Mark's to say a quick prayer, and be home in time for dinner. No one could have imagined what those final hours would bring. For generations, St. Mark's Church stood as a symbol of safety and faith. But behind its heavy wooden doors, something unimaginable was about to unfold. A crime so unthinkable it would silence an entire community for more than 60 years. At 3:35 that afternoon, Carol was seen walking into the church. A witness, an elderly parishioner lighting candles, remembered seeing her bow her head before the altar. She never saw her leave. When Carol didn't return home that evening, her parents, Frank and Margaret Dougherty, assumed she'd lost track of time. But by dusk, worry turned to dread. Frank stepped out into the growing cold. Calling his daughter's name down Radcliffe Street, he followed the route she always took, outside St. Mark's. Her bicycle rested neatly against the brick wall. The library book still sat in its basket. The church door was slightly ajar. He went inside. The inside of St. Mark's was cloaked in dim amber light. Frank's footsteps echoed across the marble floor. The smell of candle wax hung heavy in the air. He called her name again, Carol? But only silence answered back. Moments later, his cries shattered the quiet. It was a sound that would mark the beginning of Bristol's darkest chapter. Before that day, Bristol Borough was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where neighbors borrowed sugar and children played until the streetlights came on. St. Mark's wasn't just a church. It was the heart of the town. The Dougherty family lived just a few blocks away, in a modest home filled with warmth and routine. Frank worked long hours at the local factory. Margaret cared for their 3 children. Sundays were sacred. Church in the morning, dinner with the family, laughter filling the house. Carol was their middle child, bright, curious, and gentle. Her older sister Kay often said Carol seemed older than her years, with quiet maturity that made even adults listen. She loved stories about angels and saints, and once told her teacher she wanted to become a librarian, so everyone could find their favorite book. But more than anything, Carol loved her faith. She prayed daily, often stopping at St. Mark's on her way home from school. She'd light a candle, whisper a short prayer, and go on her way. In the weeks before October 22nd, parishioners noticed something unusual. A man, someone no one recognized, had been seen lingering near the back pews. He never joined services, never spoke to anyone. He just watched. At the time, no one thought much of it. This was a small town. Strangers passed through often. But afterward, everyone remembered that face. His name was William Schrader. In 1962, Schrader was a 24-year-old Army veteran. On the surface, he was polite, unremarkable, the kind of man who could disappear in a crowd. But beneath that calm exterior was something darker. That afternoon, Schrader was seen walking near the church steps, his hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the street. By 6 o'clock, police sirens pierced the quiet town. Within minutes, the area around St. Mark's was sealed off. Officers entered the church. What they found would alter Bristol's history forever. That day, something sacred was stolen. Not only a young girl's life, but the town's sense of safety. And for the next 63 years, the question lingered like an echo through those church walls. Who killed Carol Ann Dougherty? The search for 9-year-old Carol Ann Dougherty began before midnight. By dawn, every street, alley, and field around Bristol Borough had been combed by police officers, volunteers, and neighbors carrying flashlights. But the church, the one place everyone assumed was safe, became the center of fear. Inside St. Mark's, officers walked quietly through pews, careful not to disturb the scene. They found Carol's bicycle outside. Her coat was neatly folded on the bench near the altar. And then, behind the choir loft, they found her. She had been hidden in a narrow alcove beneath the stairs leading up to the organ pipes. Her small hands were clasped together, as if she had been praying. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. There were signs of assault. The priest who discovered her fainted on the spot. By morning, the entire town gathered outside the church gates. Reporters from Philadelphia arrived, flashing cameras into the cold air. Parents held their children close. Bristol Borough, once quiet and ordinary, had just become a crime scene. Detective William Sokoloff was the lead investigator assigned to the case. He had seen murder before, but never like this. Not inside a church, not involving a child. He ordered the area sealed, every parish worker questioned, every visitor logged. Within 48 hours, the investigation grew complicated. No forced entry, no broken locks, nothing stolen. Whoever did this had walked in freely, maybe even been trusted. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some blamed outsiders. Others whispered about someone within the church. But one name soon resurfaced. William Schrader, the quiet man seen loitering in the back pews. Witnesses recalled his odd behavior. He would arrive early, sit alone, and stare at the altar for long periods. He didn't seem to pray. He just watched. When police brought him in for questioning, Schrader appeared calm. He told them he was a devout man, that he came to St. Mark's to find peace after leaving the military. He denied knowing Carol. And without physical evidence linking him to crime, they had no choice but to let him go. Still, something about him unsettled Detective Sokoloff. He noted Schrader's shifting answers, the way his tone changed when talking about the church. But the investigation stalled. DNA testing didn't exist, and the evidence they had, partial fingerprints, a torn piece of fabric, led nowhere. Days turned into weeks. Carol's funeral drew hundreds. The little white casket, the hymns, the sobbing townsfolk, all of it etched into Bristol's collective memory. Her parents, Frank and Margaret, sat motionless, their faces hollow. After the funeral, St. Mark's closed its doors for months. The organ fell silent. The bells stopped ringing. The church that once symbolized faith now carried a shadow that refused to fade. Detective Sokoloff continued his pursuit quietly. He interviewed veterans who'd served with Schrader, tracing his movements from base to base. He discovered a troubling pattern. Each time Schrader moved to a new town, reports of missing girls surfaced. None of those cases were ever solved. Still, nothing concrete tied him to Carol's murder. In 1963, the case went cold. For decades, it remained unsolved, a haunting mystery whispered about in church halls and classrooms. Parents warned their children not to go out alone. Teenagers told ghost stories about the choir loft girl, but beneath those stories was a lingering truth. The killer had never been caught. In the early 2000s, when the diocese ordered renovations of the old church, construction workers unearthed a rusted metal box hidden behind the organ. Inside were faded photographs, an old rosary, and, most chillingly, newspaper clippings about the murder. Someone had kept souvenirs. The box reignited the case. And with modern forensic technology now available, the Pennsylvania State Police reopened the investigation. Detective Sokoloff was long gone, but his old notes, preserved in a sealed file marked Dougherty case, became the roadmap for a new team of investigators. They began with the old fingerprints, degraded, partial, but usable. And as technicians ran them through the new national database, something finally matched. After 60 years of silence, a name returned to file: William Schrader. When the name William Schrader reappeared on the screen, the room fell silent. Detective Laura Keating, leading the reopened cold case, leaned closer. The fingerprint recovered from the scene in 1962 matched perfectly with Schrader's military records. But there was one problem. The man was already dead. Schrader had passed away nearly 20 years earlier in a small nursing home outside Pittsburgh. His death certificate listed natural causes. To the staff there, he was nothing more than a quiet veteran who rarely spoke about his past. The revelation left investigators with mixed emotions. They finally had a name, but no suspect to interrogate, no confession to obtain. Still, they wanted answers, not just about the murder, but about the man himself. Born in 1933, William Schrader grew up in a conservative Pennsylvania household. Neighbors described him as polite, well-mannered, almost invisible. He joined the army at 19 and served in Korea, where, according to his records, he worked in logistics. But the military files hinted at something darker. There were disciplinary notes, unverified complaints from fellow soldiers, and references to behavioral instability. After leaving the army, Schrader drifted from job to job. Janitor, security guard, cemetery caretaker. He never stayed long, and wherever he went, there were whispers. Girls going missing. Children found near wooded areas, unharmed but terrified. Nothing that ever stuck, but enough to raise quiet alarms. Back in Bristol, detectives began retracing his steps. They discovered that in the year leading up to Carol Dougherty's death, Schrader volunteered occasionally at St. Mark's, helping with maintenance, sweeping floors, fixing lights. His access to the building explained how he entered undetected the night Carol disappeared. He knew the layout, the hidden stairwells, the choir loft's narrow alcoves. Forensic analysts studied what was left of the evidence box. They found a small fiber sample inside, deteriorated but intact enough for DNA testing. The results came back days later. It matched Schrader. It was the proof that had eluded Detective Sokoloff for decades. But the news did little to comfort the Dougherty family. Carol's parents had both passed away years before the breakthrough. Her younger brother, now in his 70s, received the call personally. He said only one sentence: "I knew he'd never really left." Reporters picked up the story quickly. Headlines across Pennsylvania read, "Cold case solved after 63 years." The community that once whispered about the unsolved church murder now had closure, or something close to it. But Detective Keating couldn't shake the feeling that something still didn't fit. She reviewed Schrader's later years, his move to Pittsburgh, his quiet decline. There were no signs of guilt, no hidden journals, no letters of remorse. Instead, she found evidence that someone else may have been helping him all along. In one of his old storage units, officers uncovered a second metal box. Inside were cassette tapes, dozens of them, neatly labeled with dates and initials. When forensic technicians restored and played them, what they heard sent chills through the room. Voices, conversations between Schrader and an unknown man. One tape stood out. The two discussed a girl in the church, not with guilt but with nostalgia, as if reliving a moment they both shared. Only one voice could be identified: Schrader's. The other remained a mystery. That second voice reignited the investigation. Had Schrader acted alone? Or had there been someone else involved all those years ago? Someone who'd never been found? The tapes were old and damaged, but analysts recovered fragments of sound in the background. A ticking clock, a passing train horn, phonemes playing through static. They traced those sounds to a specific location, a veterans lodge just outside Philadelphia. Records showed Schrader attended meetings there regularly in the early 1960s. Among the listed members was another familiar name, one that had appeared in Sokoloff's original notes but never led anywhere: a church volunteer, a man named Harold Jennings. When police searched Jennings' background, they found he had moved to Florida in 1965 and lived a quiet life until his death in 1998. Like Schrader, he'd escaped suspicion. But now, decades later, the shadow he left behind had returned. The discovery of Harold Jennings' connection changed everything. The case that began with one man's fingerprint had just reopened a door into something much larger, a hidden brotherhood of secrets buried under 6 decades of silence. For investigators, the discovery of the tapes changed the entire narrative. The story they thought they had solved, the lone predator who struck a child inside a church, suddenly felt incomplete. Someone else had been there, someone who spoke to Schrader as if sharing ownership of the crime. Detective Laura Keating sat in the evidence room, headphones pressed tight against her ears. The hiss of the decades-old cassette filled the silence. Then through static came a low, gravelly voice, unmistakably Schrader's. Moments later, another voice joined him, smoother, controlled, a man accustomed to authority. The exchange was chillingly casual. They discussed that October day, the choir steps, and the candle that went out too soon. There was no remorse. Only two men reminiscing about something they both understood could never be spoken aloud again. Keating's mind raced. Harold Jennings, the church volunteer, the one whose name appeared faintly in the old 1962 notes, suddenly stood at the center of everything. Back then, he'd been in his late 20s, serving as an usher and groundskeeper at St. Mark's. He was known for his charm, his easy smile, his reputation as a man of faith. But under the surface, something else was stirring. Detectives dug through archived parish records, old yearbooks, and forgotten witness statements. Buried deep in one report, they found a line from a nun who'd been interviewed in 1962. She'd told police she saw two men near the loft shortly before the girl's body was found. The lead had gone nowhere. The nun's recollection had been dismissed as confusion during shock. Now, 63 years later, her memory was being vindicated. Forensic audio analysts worked day and night to enhance the tape. They filtered noise, boosted frequencies, compared voice prints. After weeks of testing, they confirmed it. The second voice likely belonged to Harold Jennings. Though both men were long dead, the evidence spoke for them. Investigators traced Jennings' later life. He left Pennsylvania soon after the murder, moving to Florida, and becoming an active member of a small church in Sarasota. To his neighbors, he was kind and helpful, often mowing lawns for the elderly. No one suspected a thing. But in 1974, local police records showed he'd been questioned about the assault of a teenage girl. A case that mysteriously disappeared after a complaint was withdrawn. The name of the officer handling that case? William Schrader's cousin. It was a chilling web of proximity and silence. Men protecting men. Sins buried under the pretense of faith. In 2025, the grand jury reconvened one final time to review the new findings. They listened to the recordings, studied the forensic reports, and examined the men's overlapping lives. Their conclusion was grim but clear. Schrader had not acted alone. Harold Jennings was his accomplice, perhaps the one who lured Carol into the church that afternoon. Reporters gathered as District Attorney Jennifer Shorn delivered the update. Her voice was calm, but her words carried the weight of 6 decades. For the first time, she said, "We have reason to believe this was not an isolated act of violence, but a coordinated one, hidden beneath the walls of Sacred Place." Across Bristol Borough, church bells tolled as the sun set that evening. For those who remember the 1962 horror, it was a haunting echo of the past returning full circle. For Carol's surviving family, the revelation brought both closure and heartbreak. Closure, because the truth had finally been unearthed. Heartbreak, because it revealed a deeper evil than anyone had imagined. Detective Keating walked alone through St. Mark's that night, the church now quiet, preserved as a historical landmark. She stood where Carol's body had been found, her flashlight illuminating the same narrow landing. It was impossible not to feel the weight of history pressing down on the air. She whispered to herself. They hid behind faith to escape the truth, but the truth was patient. The flicker of candlelight on the altar danced in the dark, and in that stillness, the long echo of justice, slow, steady, and inevitable, seemed to fill the room. The town that had once feared the name William Schrader would now remember another name too, Harold Jennings. 2 men bound by one terrible act, and one small girl whose memory refused to fade, no matter how much time passed. When the final report was released, it felt less like the closing of a file and more like the end of a haunting. The 1962 murder of Carol Ann Dougherty had gripped Bristol Borough for generations, an open wound that refused to heal. Now, with the identification of William Schrader and Harold Jennings as the men responsible, the story that had tormented an entire town was finally being told in full. But even as investigators signed off the last pages of the case, they knew justice was something that came in pieces. Both perpetrators were long dead. There would be no courtroom, no cross-examination, no sentencing. Yet the truth itself, after 6 decades of silence, had become its own form of justice. Detective Laura Keating stood before the grand jury one final time, her voice steady. "We cannot punish the dead," she said, "but we can free the living from the weight of their secrets." Those words echoed long after she left the courthouse. For the people of Bristol, closure arrived not as celebration, but as quiet reflection. The same church that once held Carol's final moments now became a place of remembrance. A plaque bearing her name was placed near the entrance. In memory of Carol Ann Dougherty, forever loved, never forgotten. Every October, a candlelight vigil draws dozens of residents, many of whom weren't even born when the crime occurred. They stand in silence, united by a shared understanding that innocence, once lost, changes a community forever. Journalists who had covered the case for years called it one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in Pennsylvania history. Not because of the technology, though forensic science played its part, but because of persistence. Detectives, analysts, and volunteers who refused to let time erase a child's story. Among the recovered evidence, one final discovery stood out. A letter found in Harold Jennings' storage unit, dated 1964. It was addressed to W.S. Schrader. Inside, in trembling handwriting, Jennings wrote, "I pray for forgiveness every night, but the silence grows heavier. You told me no one would ever know. I believed you. God help us both." The letter was never sent. It remained folded, tucked inside a Bible that Jennings had apparently carried for decades. For many, it was proof that guilt had haunted him until the end. As investigators reviewed the letter, Keating thought about the decades of grief endured by the Dougherty family. Birthdays missed, milestones uncelebrated, prayers whispered into an empty space. Carol would have been in her 70s today. Instead, her name lived on in headlines, case files, and memories that never faded. When District Attorney Shorn addressed the public again, her tone carried the solemnity of history. "This case reminds us," she said, "that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Truth has its own timing, and sometimes it arrives only when the world is ready to hear it." The cold case unit was officially closed, but the story's echoes rippled far beyond Pennsylvania. True crime podcasts, documentaries, and investigative reports picked up the narrative, turning Carol's case into a symbol of why persistence in cold cases matters. Families from across the country began reaching out to authorities, urging them to reopen their own unsolved tragedies. In a small, dimly lit archive room, Detective Keating boxed up the remaining evidence, the photographs, transcripts, and audio cassettes that had brought the story full circle. Before sealing the box, she placed one final item inside, a photo of Carol Ann taken at a wedding just a year before her death. In the image, the little girl smiled shyly, clutching a bouquet of flowers. The innocence frozen in that picture now stood as a silent reminder of why the truth must always be pursued, no matter how cold the trail becomes. As the camera of history pulled back, Bristol Borough returned to its quiet rhythm. Children walking home from school, bells chiming from St. Mark's, the river glinting beneath the setting sun. The darkness that had once haunted the town had finally lifted, replaced by remembrance and resolve. And in that stillness, one truth remained. Time may bury evidence, fade memories, and erase names, but it cannot silence the echoes of justice.